She didn't have minutes to think it through. She didn't even have seconds. Just one breath, one instinct, one impossible choice. Let a stranger drink poison or risk everything she'd ever known. One silent movement that would expose a murder, awaken a billionaire's conscience, and prove that God still moves through trembling hands. Her name was Clara Wynne. She was 29 years old, invisible to the world that mattered, and exhausted from holding herself together with prayer and pennies. On that cold Manhattan evening, she was just trying to survive her shift at one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, earn enough in tips to keep the lights on, and get home before her faith ran dry. She wasn't looking for danger. She wasn't looking to be brave. But sometimes, heaven doesn't ask if you're ready. Sometimes it places you at the exact table, in the exact moment where you have to decide if you'll obey the voice that whispers when everyone else is silent. And Clara made a choice that saved a billionaire's life and marked her own for death. This is her story. And I promise you, by the end, you'll never think of courage the same way again. Because what started with a switched glass ended with everything changing, not just for her, but for the man who watched her do it. Stay with me. You need to hear what happened when an ordinary waitress trusted an extraordinary God. Welcome to Heartflare Stories. While you're here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your thoughts on this story and where you're watching from. The rest of Clara's shift passed in a fog of terror. She had to hide behind a smile. Her hands shook as she cleared tables. Her breath came shallow as she refilled water glasses. Every time the kitchen door swung open, her heart lurched, expecting security to drag her out, expecting the elegant woman in black to point a manicured finger and scream accusations. But nothing happened. The dining room hummed with low conversation and clinking silverware. The chandeliers glowed soft and golden. And at table 7, Silas Harrington sat perfectly still, sipping wine from the glass Clara had placed before him, while the woman across from him smiled like nothing in the world was wrong. Clara kept her head down, kept moving, kept praying under her breath. Did anyone notice? Did I just sign my own death warrant? She couldn't tell. And that was the worst part, not knowing if she'd saved a life or destroyed her own. When her manager finally released her for the night, Clara grabbed her coat and rushed toward the employee exit, desperate to disappear into the subway and pretend this night had never happened. But as she pushed through the back door into the alley, she felt it, that cold, creeping sensation of being watched. She spun around. The alley was empty, just dumpsters and shadows and the distant hum of the city. But her grandmother's voice echoed in her mind, steady and sure. When peace leaves, danger has entered. Clara pulled her coat tighter and hurried into the night. Inside the restaurant, Silas Harrington sat alone now. The woman in black had excused herself 20 minutes ago, citing a headache and an early morning meeting. Her departure had been smooth, graceful, unremarkable. But Silas had watched her eyes as she left, the way they darted toward the kitchen, toward the staff hallway, toward the exits. She was rattled, and that told him everything. Silas motioned to the manager with 2 fingers. The man appeared instantly, eager and anxious. "The wine I was served tonight," Silas said quietly. "I'd like it tested, discreetly." The manager blinked. "Sir, you heard me. Full toxicology panel. I want results by morning." "Of course, Mr. Harrington. Right away." As the manager scurried off, Silas leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers beneath his chin. He had enemies, powerful ones, men and women who smiled at fundraisers and plotted murder over spreadsheets. He'd always known the risks, but tonight someone had gotten close, closer than they ever should have. And a waitress, a woman whose name he didn't even know, had stopped it. Why? She had no reason to care whether he lived or died, no reason to risk herself for a stranger. And yet she had moved with such calm precision, such quiet certainty, that Silas couldn't shake the image from his mind. Her hands switching the glasses, her eyes meeting his for just a fraction of a second, the way she'd walked away without a word, as if she'd done nothing at all. Who was she? And why had she been so sure? Across town, in a penthouse that overlooked Central Park, the woman in black poured herself a drink with trembling hands. It should have worked. The dosage was perfect. The timing flawless. Silas Harrington should have collapsed within the hour, and by morning, the headlines would have read, "Tragic heart attack. Claims billionaire investor." The takeover would have proceeded smoothly. The board would have folded. Millions of dollars would have changed hands, and no one would have been the wiser. But something had gone wrong. She replayed the evening in her mind, frame by frame, searching for the error. And then she saw it. The waitress. The quiet one, with the downcast eyes. The one who moved like a ghost. She'd been at the table. She'd been holding the wine. The woman in black set down her glass and reached for her phone. This wasn't over. If the girl had seen something, if she suspected something, she was a liability, and liabilities had to be eliminated, quietly, efficiently, before anyone asked questions. She typed a single message and hit send. Find the waitress. Clara made it home just after midnight. Her apartment was a fifth-floor walk-up in a building that smelled like mildew and fried food. The walls were thin, the heat barely worked, and the lock on her door was held together with prayer and duct tape. But it was hers, and tonight it felt like a fortress. She bolted the door, kicked off her shoes, and collapsed onto her second-hand couch. Her body ached, her mind raced, and her spirit was at war with itself. Had she done the right thing, or had she just made a terrible, foolish mistake? Clara closed her eyes and did the only thing she knew how to do. She prayed. Not for reward, not for recognition, just for protection, for clarity, for God to cover her with whatever mercy He had left. "I don't know what I just did," she whispered into the silence. "But if you put me there, if you showed me what I saw, then please, don't let it be for nothing. Don't let me die for this." The apartment stayed quiet, but somewhere deep in her chest, beneath the fear and exhaustion, Clara felt something she couldn't name. Not peace exactly, but presence, like she wasn't alone, like someone was watching over her, even now. She didn't know if that would be enough. The next morning, Clara's phone buzzed with a message from the restaurant. "Mr. Harrington requests a private meeting. Tomorrow. 2 p.m. Do not discuss this with anyone." Clara stared at the screen until her vision blurred. Her first thought, "I'm being fired." Her second thought, "I'm being silenced." Her third thought, the one that made her stomach twist into knots, "I'm not walking out of that meeting alive." She thought about running, about packing a bag and disappearing into some small town where no one knew her name. But where would she go? And what would she live on? So instead, Clara did what she always did. She got dressed, she went to work, and she prayed that God hadn't brought her this far just to let her fall. But deep down, beneath the faith and the fear, one question haunted her. What does a billionaire do to the woman who knows too much? Clara arrived at the private address 15 minutes early, her palms slick with sweat despite the November cold. The building was nothing like she'd imagined. No towering corporate headquarters, no security guards with earpieces, just a quiet brownstone on the Upper East Side with a simple black door and a brass knocker that gleamed in the afternoon light. She almost turned around 3 times, but at exactly 2 p.m., the door opened, and Silas Harrington stood there himself. No assistant, no intermediary, just him, in a gray sweater and dark jeans, looking more human than he had any right to. "Miss Wynne," he said quietly, "thank you for coming." Clara's voice caught in her throat. She managed a nod. He stepped aside, and she walked into a warmly lit sitting room that smelled like leather and old books. The kind of space that whispered wealth without shouting it. Silas gestured to a chair. Clara sat, gripping the armrests like they might anchor her to earth. He sat across from her, leaning forward, hands clasped loosely, between his knees. And then he said the last thing she expected. "You saved my life." Clara blinked. Her breath stuttered. "I don't—" "The wine was tested," Silas continued, his voice steady but strained. "Digitalis. Enough to stop my heart within the hour and make it look like natural causes." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "You saw something. You acted. And because of that, I'm still breathing." Tears burned Clara's eyes before she could stop them. "I didn't know for sure," she whispered. I felt something, like a warning, like God was telling me something was wrong and I had to listen." Her voice broke. "I didn't know if I was crazy. I didn't know if I'd just ruined everything. I was so scared." Silas leaned back, his expression unreadable. "You acted on faith." "I acted on what little I had left," Clara said, wiping her face with shaking hands. "I'm nobody, Mr. Harrington. I pour wine in clear plates and pray I can pay rent. I'm not supposed to be involved in things like this. I'm not supposed to matter." "But you do," Silas said quietly. "And now someone knows it." The room went cold. Silas stood and walked to the window, his silhouette framed against the fading daylight. "The woman you saw that night," he said, his tone careful, controlled. "Her name is Vivian Calloway. She's a corporate strategist, brilliant, ruthless, and currently orchestrating a hostile takeover of my company." He turned to face Clara. "She needed me dead to make it work. Clean, quiet, no questions asked." Clara's stomach twisted. "And now she knows I'm the reason it didn't work." Silas nodded. "I had my security team investigate. You've been followed. Your building's been surveilled. Someone left a message on your door 2 nights ago. Accidents happen to those who see too much." Clara's hands went numb. She hadn't seen any message. She'd been working a double shift. "I'm already dead," she whispered. "No," Silas said firmly. "You're not." He crossed the room and crouched in front of her chair, meeting her eyes at level. "I'm offering you protection, Clara. Real protection. A secure apartment, security detail, legal representation. Everything you need to stay safe while I dismantle this conspiracy the right way. Through the courts, through the law, through the truth." Clara stared at him, searching for the catch. "Why?" "Because you didn't ask for anything in return," Silas said simply. "You didn't try to blackmail me. You didn't leverage what you knew. You just did the right thing, and I'm not going to let you die for it." "I don't want your money," Clara said, her voice trembling. "I don't want to owe you." "You won't," Silas said. "This isn't ownership. It's protection. You keep your job if you want it. You keep your life. You keep your dignity. I'm just making sure you're alive to live it." Clara closed her eyes, and for the first time in days, she felt the faintest whisper of peace. Maybe this was why. Maybe this was the reason God had put her in that room, at that table, at that exact moment. Not to be rescued, but to reveal the truth. Over the next 2 weeks, Silas moved like a man possessed. He hired forensic accountants. He subpoenaed records. He brought in federal investigators and laid the entire conspiracy bare. Corporate espionage, bribery, murder for profit, and a network of shell companies designed to funnel millions into offshore accounts. Vivian Calloway was arrested on a Thursday morning in front of her Park Avenue office, her perfectly composed face finally cracking as cameras flashed and reporters swarmed. The headlines screamed betrayal. The board scrambled to distance themselves, and Silas, for the first time in his career, felt something other than ambition driving him. He felt purpose. Clara, meanwhile, sat in a small but secure apartment across town, watching the news unfold on a television that didn't flicker or cut out. The threats had stopped, the shadows had disappeared, and slowly, carefully, she began to believe she might actually survive this. But more than that, she began to understand. God hadn't saved her from invisibility. He'd used her invisibility as a weapon, because no one watches the waitress, no one suspects the quiet ones, and sometimes that's exactly the kind of person heaven needs. When it was finally over, Silas came to see her one last time. They sat in a small cafe. Two people the world would never think belonged in the same room, but here they were, alive, changed, awake. "What will you do now?" Silas asked. Clara smiled, a real one this time. "I'm going back to school. Nursing. I've been putting it off for years, but I think it's time." Silas nodded. "You'll be incredible." "And you?" Clara asked. "What happens to the empire?" Silas looked out the window, his jaw tight. "I'm rebuilding it. The right way this time. With integrity. With accountability. With people who don't see murder as a business strategy." Clara reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Power without righteousness invites destruction," she said softly. "My grandmother used to say that." Silas looked at her hand, then at her face, and for the first time in years, he felt something close to hope. "Thank you, Clara," he said, "for everything." "Thank you for listening," Clara replied. And in that small cafe, two lives forever altered by one silent act of faith, they sat together in the quiet knowledge that sometimes courage doesn't shout. Sometimes it simply obeys. 6 months later, Clara stood in front of a mirror in a studio apartment she could actually afford, adjusting the collar of her nursing school uniform. The fear that had stalked her for weeks after that November night had finally loosened its grip. The shadows no longer followed her home. The anonymous messages had stopped, and slowly, like a flower unclenching after winter, her faith had begun to bloom again, stronger, deeper, rooted in something she couldn't see but could no longer deny. God had been there all along, not in the miracles she'd begged for, rent paid on time, an easier life, a way out of exhaustion, but in the quiet preparation, in the years of invisibility that had trained her to notice what others missed, in the grandmother's wisdom that had planted warnings in her spirit, in the exact placement of her hands on that November night. She hadn't been forgotten. She'd been positioned. Clara grabbed her backpack and headed out the door, her heart lighter than it had been in years. Today was her first day of clinical rotations, and for the first time in her life, she wasn't just surviving. She was becoming. Across the city, in a corner office that now felt less like a throne and more like a responsibility, Silas Harrington signed the final document that would reshape his company from the ground up. New board members, new ethics policies, new partnerships with organizations that prioritize people over profit. It had taken months of brutal negotiations, public scrutiny, and painful conversations with shareholders who cared more about stock prices than souls. But Silas didn't care anymore. He'd spent 2 decades building an empire on ambition and strategy, believing that power was its own justification. That success meant winning, no matter the cost. That the only thing that mattered was staying on top. And then a waitress with trembling hands had reminded him that goodness still existed. That courage didn't require a boardroom or a billion-dollar portfolio. That sometimes the most powerful thing a person could do was simply obey the voice that whispered when everyone else stayed silent. Silas set down his pen and stared out the window at the city below. Millions of people moving through their lives, invisible to each other, unaware of the quiet heroism happening in kitchens and subway cars and hospital hallways. He thought of Clara often, wondered how she was doing, hoped she knew that what she'd done hadn't just saved his life. It had saved his soul. 2 years passed. Clara graduated at the top of her class. The ceremony was held in a large auditorium filled with families, flowers, and the hum of celebration. Clara sat among her classmates, cap and gown slightly too big, hands folded in her lap, heart pounding with a joy she'd almost forgotten existed. She scanned the crowd for familiar faces, but didn't expect to see many. Her life had been small for so long. No extended family, few close friends, just her and God and the dream she'd refused to let die. But when her name was called and she walked across the stage to receive her diploma, she saw him. Silas Harrington. Sitting quietly in the back row, dressed in a simple suit, clapping with the rest of the crowd, but watching her with something that looked like pride. Their eyes met for just a second, and Clara felt the weight of everything that had happened crash over her like a wave. The glass, the fear, the faith, the moment that changed everything. She smiled, tears streaming down her face, and Silas nodded once, a gesture of respect, of gratitude, of recognition. You mattered, that nod said. You always mattered. Clara clutched her diploma to her chest and walked off the stage, her heart so full it ached. After the ceremony, they found each other in the lobby. Silas extended his hand, and Clara shook it, laughing through her tears. You came, she said, incredulous. I wouldn't have missed it, Silas replied. You've worked too hard. So have you, Clara said, gesturing to the news she'd followed over the past 2 years, his company's transformation, his philanthropy, his public commitment to ethical leadership. I've been keeping up. You're doing something good, Mr. Harrington. Silas, he corrected gently, and I'm trying. You showed me it was possible. They stood there for a moment, two people from impossibly different worlds, bound together by one silent act of obedience that had rippled farther than either of them could have imagined. I still think about that night, Clara admitted. I still wonder what would have happened if I'd ignored that feeling, if I'd just kept walking. But you didn't, Silas said. You listened. And because of that, 2 lives were saved. Clara tilted her head. 2? Mine, Silas said. And yours. Clara's breath caught. He was right. That night hadn't just stopped a murder. It had stopped her slow disappearance into despair. It had reminded her that her life had meaning, that her faith wasn't foolish, that God still moved through ordinary people willing to take extraordinary risks. Thank you, Clara whispered. No, Silas said, his voice thick with emotion. Thank you. Years later, when people asked Clara how she'd made it through nursing school, how she'd survived the hardest season of her life, she never told them about the billionaire, or the conspiracy, or the glass of poisoned wine. She simply said, I learned to listen. And when they pressed for details, she'd smile and say, sometimes God whispers, and if you're quiet enough, brave enough, faithful enough, you hear Him and you obey, even when it doesn't make sense, even when you're terrified, even when the world tells you you're nobody. Because Clara had learned the truth that the world tries so hard to hide. God doesn't need the loud ones. He doesn't need the famous ones. He doesn't need the powerful ones. He just needs the ones willing to say yes when He whispers, the ones willing to switch a glass in silence and trust that heaven sees. The world never noticed the waitress, but heaven did, and one life was never the same again. Neither was the man she saved. And somewhere in the quiet corners of eternity, where courage is measured not in volume But in obedience, a record was written. She listened. She obeyed. She trusted. And God did the rest.